Hello, this is Sam Gerrans from samgerrans.com. Today is Monday, May 29th, 2023, and today the subject is Propaganda Must Be Continuous and 1984. Now, if you know my channel, what I do on Mondays, I do a long form piece, which is a part of it's on YouTube, but the bulk of it is on my Substack for my paid subscribers, but this will be the introduction to it. I do recommend that you sign up for my Substack, which you can do for free, because when I get banned or deplatformed or whatever they decide to call it at that time, it'll mean that I can still email people and tell them if I'm going to be producing any more content. The time to build the ark is before the rain. Once it rains, it's too late. That's just the way it works. Do support my work, because if you don't, then I won't be able to do it. It's as simple as that. Substack paying for a Substack subscription is a good way of doing that. Or you can donate. If you don't do it, eventually I'm going to go and do other things, and I'm going to be doing currently 3 a week, because I need to use the other 2 days to support my family and do other things, you see, because people don't understand it, but this is time, and it takes time, and that's just how it is. But anyway, that's all right. It doesn't really, I understand the time we live in and how it all works, but in the meantime, I'm going to continue while it's possible. So what I'm going to be doing is looking at this book, which is Propaganda by Jacques Ellul, and I highly recommend that you buy a copy if you want to understand it. The reason why I'm going through all of this is because he writes in a rather, it's not turgid, it's just a rather an exact way, and we're all being dumbed down by social media, by a completely inhuman way of living. It's an untraditional way of living, and I think people from the Middle Ages or late antiquity, looking at how we live now, would correctly come to the conclusion that we are insane, and as a society we are. And part of that is that people can't read anymore, unfortunately. And it's a skill, and there are different types of reading. There's reading a meme, there's reading sort of glancing over emojis, and then there's actually reading an email, let's say, and then there's reading a novel, and then they're reading scripture, and then there's reading difficult books. This is a difficult book, and what I try to do is to sort of break it down into bite-sized pieces, but not such bite-sized pieces that it's just sort of like a 5-second, 10-second short or whatever, TikTok. Those people aren't my audience. I'm interested in people who are still thinking, and we have to sort of man the lifeboats, as it were. Anyway, I'm going to get into that, but I'm also going to be looking at 1984. Here we are, George Orwell's 1984, which I reread a couple of days ago, and I've read it about 3 or 4 times now. It's one of the sort of core books of my canon, as it were, and I'd highly recommend reading it. It's a much easier read than Ellul, and it will give you a lot of insight into how things actually work. I'm going to interweave my presentation today with some quotes from 1984, which I've sort of identified. Hopefully I'll be able to find them when I need them. We'll see how that's going to work out. Anyway, let's just jump into this. We're now looking at page 17 of Propaganda. Last week we were looking at the fact that propaganda is total propaganda. Well, today he's talking about the continuity and duration of propaganda. Let's just begin. Propaganda must be continuous and lasting. Continuous in that it must not leave any gaps, but it must fill the citizen's whole day and all his days. Lasting in that it must function over a very long period of time. Now, when most people think about propaganda, it's a bit how men think about marketing. They think it doesn't affect me. It's just for women. It affects women. Doesn't affect me. I make my decisions independently. That's not true at all. What is true is that you notice bad marketing. You notice marketing which is sudden. You notice propaganda which is sudden. We'll get to that later. I think in the second half of this, when he talks about elections and so on, people realise, of course, that this campaign pushing candidate X over a month or 2 weeks, whatever it is. Of course it's propaganda, but they don't realize that they're living in propaganda, much as a goldfish doesn't realize that he's living in water. And this is effective propaganda. And I'll just give you some examples of the propaganda that you live in all day long and don't recognize probably. Music is propaganda. If you listen to the music that's promoted today, I wouldn't even call it music, most of it. It's has a single agenda to do with degrading you. If you look at the lyrics of modern songs, especially so-called black, so-called music, it's an abomination. And if you allow that pollution into you, and especially after a while, I suppose, I mean, I never did, but if you acquire a habit of it or a sort of a taste for it, that's propaganda. And the real trick with propaganda is to make you pay for it. You see, that's just the way it works. Movies, television, films, all of that stuff, it's entirely propaganda. And of course you stop and you think, oh, well, Sam, you're talking about a big conspiracy. How could everybody be in on it? It doesn't work like that. Well, I certainly admit that most people have got no idea how it works. What they are is useless eaters, according to the elites, and useful idiots, according to the elites also. So most people don't even think about it. They just acquire what's going on around them and then gush along with it. And if you've ever worked in a large company, you've seen precisely how that works. I'll give you an example of the kind of intellectual, philosophical and propagandistic lockstep everybody's in. Just as an example, let's look at how they rolled out the homosexualization agenda across all corporations. Who voted for this? Who wanted this? Is it to do with this so-called holy majority? No, because the vast majority of people, it doesn't affect them at all. So that's just an example, and now you're not allowed to use. And now they've got you using imaginary pronouns and all the rest of it. People will go along with it. Most people just kind of work out what's going on and they gush along in the same direction. So it doesn't require them to be intellectually invested in it. Most of them haven't got a clue. They haven't got the brains they were born with, and that's a fair assumption. And that's actually nothing. The brains they were born with. It's not actually to do with intelligence. In fact, you need a certain amount of intelligence to be capable of being highly indoctrinated. It's interesting how it works. What it's actually a different quotient. It's a different part of the mind. And trying to reason with propaganda is like trying to use a pitchfork to empty the sea. You'll never ever be able to do it. And if you are able to see these sorts of things and you happen to have a highly propagandized, let's say, family, which you probably will have, you'll have noticed that reason doesn't play any part of it. It's to do with triggers. It's to do with how their neural system has been acclimatized to a set of inputs, very much like how a computer works. And that's really how it works. Education's propaganda. It's complete propaganda. I'll give you an example. You probably think of the past as being some benighted, terrible place where everybody just walked around suffering from scurvy and, working in the fields 24 hours a day, being beaten over the head by, the local lord. I mean, maybe some of the past was a bit like that, but I think they'd be horrified, the people in the past, to look at today and see what most people believe and how society is going. They would be very happy to be living in the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, whatever we mean by Middle Ages. Middle Ages is a bit of a moving target as far as I can see, or late antiquity, whenever it was. That's how they would be horrified to see what you're doing to your children and what you allow your children to be educated in. And in fact, they wouldn't consider it an education. I mean, if you look at the trivium, they would consider this. They wouldn't consider it an education of any kind at all. This isn't arrogance or snobbery. They would just think you were barbarians. Frankly, I mean that's pretty much. And I would argue they were right. Now, of course, you can say, well, they had their own type of propaganda. Yeah, but it was different. It wasn't total. And this is what Ilul is talking about. And really, when we mean total, we mean electronic, because that's the only way that it works. So all media is essentially propaganda. And yes, again, if you look at the kind of propaganda you get in corporations, I've worked in a few. I've worked in large companies and small companies. Actually, both have their own types of propaganda, if you want to call it that, to some extent. Now, we are social creatures. We like to create a society in which we're using similar nomenclature and we're talking to each other in ways that make us feel as if we're part of the group and all of that. So it's not like we don't have hardwired into us a certain a certain inclination in this direction. But this is a science. It's been learnt and it works. Now, I'm not here arguing that and nor is Zilul actually. He's not arguing that this is some evil that needs to be exposed, and when it's exposed, it will cease. That's not his argument, and it's not my argument. My argument is a little bit different to his, but perhaps won't get into that right now. But what his argument is that we're living under something called technique. And what technique is essentially anywhere that is modern, anywhere that's on the conveyor belt towards modernization has handed over the keys of its culture to technique. And it's easy to think of technique as being the same thing as technology. Technology is a manifestation of technique, but it isn't the sole definition of it. What technique is, I've been through this in more detail in other places, but what it is essentially is adoption of a philosophy in which rationale and which optimum outcomes in terms of production are the only really important things. The things that your forefathers, the people in the medieval times and the late antiquity, there's been knighted morons who didn't know it, but they were just basically trying to feel their way toward the apogee of civilization that we've reached today. Those people that just produced these sort of, very, very kind of average moronic people like Thomas Aquinas, Socrates, people like that, people we don't care about anymore. Those people, right? Those people had, they had a form of propaganda, you could call it that, but they didn't live in this electronic soup, which we live in now. And if you look at Kaczynski, for example, I'm not here to advocate all of his ideas, but he was certainly right about a few things. And so really when we're talking about technique, what we're really talking about is a society in which the foundation upon which our forefathers lived is completely rejected. And that includes things like family. It includes things like normal sexuality. It means that you're basically an atom being interfacing with the state with no one to protect you. It means that's where it all goes because it's efficient, and that propaganda itself is a requirement of this. So it's not just that propaganda is evil. That's not quite the argument. The argument is that technique is a kind of a demon, if you want to put it that way, that is pretty much possessed the world. And that when you sign your soul over to this, you actually need propaganda, because the intrinsic existential angst that comes about by living in this completely unnatural world needs it needs to be calmed down. It needs to be you need insulation against it. And so propaganda is efficient and required. People want it, they desire it, they need it. If you didn't have propaganda, you couldn't live in a technological society because you go mad. In fact, you are mad. You are mad, and at least you would be considered mad by pretty much anybody who'd ever lived before. What propaganda is designed to do is to make your insanity palatable. That's really what it's for. So it's not like there isn't a demand for it. There's a big demand for it. Anyway, I have a bit that I want to read from 1984. I've got a very complex system of notes here, so I hope I can find it. Yes, I think I can find the first one. You know what? So this is from page 50. This is, okay. Even if you haven't read 1984, you probably know roughly what it's about. It's the sort of central character is a chap called Winston Smith. He works in the Ministry of Truth, I believe, and he is essentially the last man. And in fact, that's what Orwell was going to call this book before he called it 1984. He was going to call it The Last Man, but there's another book called that. I think, was it Mary Shelley? I can't remember. Anyway, doesn't matter. So it's a dystopian nightmare. Now, obviously, you don't quite live in a dystopian nightmare yet, but you will be quite soon, because they're going to, if you live in the West, they're impoverishing you. If you haven't worked that out yet, if you haven't worked out that the war, the war against Russia and all of this is really about, it's not only about, but it's also about impoverishing you. Anyway, we'll just jump into it. Page 50. And the records department, after all, was itself only a single branch of the Ministry of Truth, whose primary job was not to reconstruct the past, but to supply the citizens of Oceania with newspapers, films, textbooks, telescreen programs, plays, novels, with every conceivable kind of information, instruction or entertainment, from a statue to a slogan, from a lyric poem to a biological treatise, and from a child's spelling book to a Newspeak dictionary. I'm not going to get into what Newspeak was, but read the book. And the ministry had not only to supply the multifarious needs of the party, but also to repeat the whole operation at a lower level for the benefit of the proletariat. Now, if we let's say that by the party we mean corporate drones, anyone who's working in that kind of world. And I've worked in that world too, so I know. That's basically the party, okay? And the proletariat, people that go to football matches and used to go to pubs when they existed in the UK and all of that. They're kind of the unthinking, a lot of decent people. A lot of them are excellent people, but they're not, they're not high achievers. And in some ways, they're actually more natural. You'll find, and in fact, Winston Smith tends to feel that that's, if there's any hope, it lies in those people. But we don't have party members in the West walking around in dungarees. They tend to wear business suits. And the ministry had not only to supply the multifarious needs of the party, but also to repeat the whole operation at the lower level for the benefit of the proletariat. So there's one lot of propaganda for the party. All those drones working in corporations, they're highly, highly propagandized. And if they cease being propagandized, they'll be out. So if they have to keep it to themselves. But you have a whole new load of stuff for the drones, the kind of the proles, which is different. There was a whole chain of separate departments dealing with proletarian literature, music, drama and entertainment generally. Here were produced rubbishy newspapers containing almost nothing except sport, crime and astrology, sensational 5-cent novelettes, films oozing with sex, and sentimental songs which were composed entirely by mechanical means on a special kind of kaleidoscope known as a versificator. This was written in 1948, published in 1948. What do you think rap music is? It's the most degenerate. It's made by machine. It's interesting, isn't it? If you think about music, that it's if you look at the different types of music, the predominant types of music, and how people danced. If you look at how people danced when a waltz, it's an organized society divided into families, moving in these sort of lolloping movements around as a cogent society. And then you look at people jumping up and down and, sort of basically boasting individually in this sort of violent, kind of savage way to this so-called rap, so-called music. If you like rap music, well, it just shows how jaded your taste has become. But the fact is that it's interesting that this kind of boom, 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 this unthinking, individualistic, mechanical music is just correct for mechanical drones. It's just, and even going back to things like that kind of music that came out of is it Chicago? I can't remember. Sorry, wherever they used to produce the cars. There was that place that's absolutely collapsing. It's not Chicago. I'm blanking on it. But there was a whole music that came out of it. It had this very particular beat, dun 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 dun, and it was designed for people who were working in these sorts of factories. Anyway, all I'm trying to say is it is propaganda. Now, does it mean that every single band, they all understand all this? No, of course not. It's to do with a money spigot. That's all you have to control. People are self-correcting. They'll understand which way the wind's blowing. If the money spigot was interested in promoting, highly complex layered music, such as Handel or Bach, right? That's what you'd get. They don't want it. They want you demoralized and moronic, and so they give you demoralized, moronic, so-called music. If you listen to the music, I'm sorry to go on about music, but if you listen to, the kind of music that they're pumping into women's minds, if you try and listen to it, If you listen to Coldplay, which I'm expect I'm a lot out of date, but I've listened to some Coldplay, I've heard some of their songs. If you listen to the lyrics, they don't mean anything. They mean nothing. And they appeal to a woman who, it's one kind of lozenge of feeling that attaches to the next lozenge of feeling. Each of them appear to mean something very significant, but none of them mean anything at all. If you listen to that long enough, guess what you'd become? You'd become a solipsistic, irrational, kind of nut job who was driven by feelings only and would be completely unreliable, especially as any sort of sexual or marriage partner. There you are. So it works. Anyway, here were produced rubbishy newspapers containing almost nothing except sport, crime, astrology, sensational 5-cent novelettes, films oozing with sex, and sentimental songs which were composed entirely by mechanical means on a special kind of kaleidoscope known as a versificator. There was even a whole subsection, pornosec, it was called in Newspeak, engaged in producing the lowest kind of pornography, which was sent out in sealed packets, and which no party member other than those who worked on it was permitted to look at. Okay, now obviously, this is set in a particular time, particular society, but it still has a high relevance for what we're doing today. Anyway, let's move on with Ilul. Propaganda tends to make the individual live in a separate world. He must not have outside points of reference. He must not be allowed a moment of meditation or reflection in which to see himself vis-a-vis the propagandist, or even propaganda, as happens when the propaganda is not continuous. I'll just give you an example of this from popular culture. It's not popular, it's been given to you, but The Truman Show. The Truman Show is an interesting film, and it has some relevant parallels. But if you think about it, when Truman starts to wake up and realize that this is all fake, I'm not going to go on about this for a long time, because in case you haven't seen The Truman Show, but it's definitely worth a watch I mean, for me, I watch films, I only really watch them for the propaganda. I understand, it's, as I said before, it's a bit for me watching that sort of stuff because I have a background in it. I've studied it. I've studied screenplay writing. I've studied propaganda in depth. So it's a bit, for me, I know nothing about food, let's say. If I go to a restaurant, I have no idea. But propaganda I do know about. So when I watch a film, I'm really just waiting for the propaganda payload. The storyline and all of that, I don't, the humour, they use the humour to put things into your mind, to get you used to the next part of the agenda that's coming along. I understand all of that. I'm just really looking for what the actual payoff is going to be. At that moment, the individual emerges from the grip of propaganda. Instead, successful propaganda will occupy every moment of the individual's life. And just on a point of this, if you look at people, they can't. If you walk around the streets and you can bear to look at the people walking around you, and I live in Russia, and you hear a lot of people are very emotional about Russia at the moment. They tend to think either that it's evil incarnate or that it's saving the world from unipolar tyranny. I don't actually hold to either of those points of view, but here, as everywhere, you'll find that the Russians walking around engrossed in their telephones. If you look around you, I'm sure it's the same in the West now, nobody can actually hold a conversation. I had a business meeting with a young woman, and I met her in a cafe, and we sat down to talk, and I'd made an appointment to meet her, and it was, we were there on, for a particular purpose. And as we're talking, she started picking her phone up and checking it. I just picked it up. I took it out of her hand and put it on the other side of the table. I mean, I've made my time to come and meet you. I want a conversation. I'm not going to deal with some distracted bimbo. I want your attention. In fact, I insist on having it. And I just I had to do it about 3 or 4 times. Eventually, she got the message. I didn't ask. I just picked it up, took it out of her hand, and put it down. And this idea that you're here just as a sort of temporary placeholder in between me and my virtual life. No. I'm sorry, if you can't hold a thought for 30 seconds, but I can, and I'm here for a reason, and this is my time, and that's how I deal with them. But you know, obviously, you're walking around. Everybody's lost in their propaganda all day long. So, and this was written. Propaganda was written 1964. The English edition written in 1965. It's older than me. This book. Through posters and loudspeakers when he's out walking, through radio and newspapers at home, through meetings and movies in the evening. The individual must not be allowed to recover, to collect himself, to remain untouched by propaganda during any relatively long period. For propaganda is not the touch of the magic wand, it is based on slow, constant impregnation. And this is really my point about propaganda. A lot of people think, oh, I'd notice propaganda if I see it. No, you won't. None of it's any good. What do you think the 6 o'clock news is? What do you think the advertising is? What do you think your education was? What do you think the music is you listen to? What do you think even your house, the architecture that you live in? I'll give you an example if you don't believe me. 200 years ago, the centre of the house was the hearth. This is the place that everybody gathered round in the evening and looked into the embers, entered that kind of dream state, that place where the kind of cold harsh of light of day meets the full-on dream state. And this was a collective experience. People looked into the fire and they told their stories and discussed things and often just went into a form of reverie. Reverie is almost dead. So what's the centre of the world now? The centre of the house, the centre of the family, the centre of the architecture. Well, it's the television screen. We don't actually possess a television. People come in here and they're kind of, you can see that they're, well, not many people coming because I don't actually like a lot of people coming in here, but there are a few people that we do allow into our flat. You can see them feeling a little bit lost, that there isn't this plasma screen dominating the space. What I'm trying to say is I'm not here just criticizing people, although it may come across that way. I'm saying that the reason why there is this propaganda is because it's actually necessary. It's a necessary part of technique. Yeah, you couldn't stand it without it. People can't stand it. They can't stand being alone. They can't stand thinking. They can't stand not thinking. They have to be immersed in it all the time. Yeah, okay, I think I've hit that point. Let's move on. There's a side note here which I'm just going to hit. It's one of the footnotes. The famous principle of repetition, which is not in itself significant, plays a part only in this situation. And he's talking about propaganda lasting for a long period of time. Hitler was undoubtedly right when he said that the masses take a long time to understand and remember. Thus, it is necessary to repeat. And this is why they keep their propaganda. If we're talking about agitprop, which you might get, for example, during an election, like let's take Obama. What was it? Change. What does change mean? It means whatever you want it to mean, over and over and over and over again. So that's just an example of it. It takes a long time to understand and remember, thus it is necessary to repeat, but the emphasis must be placed on, quote, a long time. The public must be conditioned to accept the claims that are made, which they are. And what happens when that is complete, or when you've reached a sort of a workable level, is that people have a worldview. And if you want to understand how that works, just go and live in if you can find anywhere that's very different, although you won't find anywhere that's very, very, very different. But if you went to, Mali or somewhere, and the countryside, then you'd find things that were very different, and all of your indoctrination would be worth very little there. Although they're all going to be on the technique conveyor belt as well. So what you find when you travel is not that they used to say that that travel broadens the mind. I don't know that that's true anymore. I would say that travel, almost this sort of incessant traveling, everyone wants to travel. They want to travel. Everywhere's the same. And what you find is that you're just visiting various flavors of generica, because everybody believes essentially the same religion. I'm not going to go over this again, but they do. The public must be conditioned to accept the claims that are made. In any case, repetition must be discontinued when the public has been conditioned, for at that point repetition will begin to irritate and provoke fresh doubts with respect to former certainties. So this is, it's an art as much as it is a science. Anyway, let's continue. It creates convictions and compliance through imperceptible influences that are effective only by continuous repetition. So I'll give you a couple of examples of continuous repetition. This is agitprop as opposed to integrated propaganda. So this is the kind of propaganda which is to get you angry now rather than to kind of lay down the strata in your mind of all the assumptions that you're going to make throughout your life. I'm not talking about that type of propaganda. I'm talking about getting you angry kind of propaganda, which is more short term. Russia's unprovoked war of aggression. How many times have you heard that? Russia's unprovoked war of aggression. Now, if you believe that sentence, it means you know nothing, zero, about this conflict. But that line will have been crafted by propagandists. It's been sort of disseminated to all of the talking heads and all of the people who you think are authoritative, and there they are. Russia's unprovoked war of aggression. And that's just an example. Repetition. It must create a complete environment for the individual, one from which he never emerges, and to prevent him from finding external points of reference. It protects him by censoring everything that might come in from the outside. So, I'll give you an example. They closed down. I'm not saying Russia doesn't have propaganda. The West does have propaganda. I'm talking about the West now because my audience is in the West and I'm speaking to things of their recent experience. So let's say you've been told all of your life that you live in a democracy, which I won't get into that for now, and how ludicrous that idea is. Just as an idea, it's an insane idea. And anyway, we'll leave that to one side. And that you have a free exchange of ideas, and that this is part of a democracy. But what you don't notice at the same time as you have all this free exchange of ideas, and you're considerate and embracing of various points of view, is your government has shut out altogether Russia Today. You can't get it in the West. They've chucked them off YouTube, although they had over 1 billion views. I'm not here extolling the virtues of Russia Today necessarily. I'm just saying that you live under a censorship. Press TV, which is Iran's sort of equivalent of Russia Today, they've had their website pulled. I mean, literally, I think, if I'm not mistaken, they actually revoked their domain name of their website, something that they owned. And this is what you'll find is that ownership doesn't count for anything anymore. You have this mythology of of ownership and the order of law. There is no rule of law. It doesn't exist. If they want you to come and get you, that's as simple as it is. Shadow banning. How about that? I'm shadow banned. I know that for a fact. All kinds of people are shadow banned. So if they don't want you out there, it doesn't matter how much content you make, how regular you are, all the rest of it, you just don't get into the results. Now I understand, of course. Let's say take my channel just for an example. Of course, it's not going to appeal to. It's not a mass appeal. I understand that, but still, I would have thought I would have be able to reach a broader audience than I do. But anyway, it's just just accept it as part of how it is. Facebook banned Seymour Hersh. Well, they didn't ban him, but what they did is anybody who tried to disseminate his article about Nord Stream, they pulled up some sort of disinformation warning, just as an example. What about journalists, modern journalists? So I worked in public relations, so I met a lot of journalists. They're the most ignorant people you'll ever meet, pretty much on almost every subject. Not only are they ignorant, they're fanatically ignorant. Their lack of curiosity is stunning, and in fact they'll kind of respond to any mild provocation to use their mind, either with withering contempt, or with suspicion, or with some sort of humour. They understand, I think, at some level, that their job is to be consistently stupid, to miss the elephant in the room all day long. That's their job, and I think most of them know it. If you want a really good example of a kind of enthusiastic, completely sold out prostitute, there's a girl called True Bell. I believe she works for The Independent. Now here's somebody who, she has no interest in the truth whatsoever, none, zero. She will write any lie all day long as somebody's paying. And I think she just simply doesn't care. She knows that's the job. If it was a different system, she'd be writing that. These people, they have no. This isn't a complaint. This is an observation. They have no inner anchor, none whatsoever. Just like read 1984, you'll get it. Anyway, let's get on to the next one. Just on the point of journalists, Nord Stream. If you can't see that your media is totally in lockstep, completely controlled after this, then I'm sorry, you won't have listened this far. You'll be looking at Pornhub or the Disney Channel or something. 9/11. If you haven't worked that one out, for goodness sake, you're really telling me that 19 Arabs with box cutters who couldn't fly a Cessna managed to take down 3 buildings in New York with 2 planes? There's a thing that happens and you see, I'm using logic here, but logic has got nothing to do with it. It's to do with an emotional buy-in. People want to belong, they want to believe, they want to be a part of the group. And if you're saying something which isn't part of the group, well, then you're a threat to that. And you have to understand that's why you can't talk to your family. It's why you can't talk to people. They're not interested. They don't care about truth. It doesn't matter to them. It may matter to you, but it won't matter to them. It doesn't matter to them. How do you think the Salem witch hunts happened? How do you think Matthew the witch finder was able to to do what he did? Or the persecutions of the Catholic Church, or rooting out the wreckers or the bourgeoisie under the Soviets. You're living under exactly the same kind of system. It's just a bit kind of more colourful in places. It's dreary, getting drearier, especially if you live in the West. But you still have a much more efficient propaganda than they had, and that's why it's being held together with propaganda and sellotape. Deplatforming, that's happening. It'll happen to me sooner or later, I guess. Defunding, all of that sort of thing. So that's how they shut everybody down. So if you have this impression, a delusion, and it is a delusion, that you live in a free society, you've been told it long enough, but try exercising, see how far you get. Try saying something, you don't like something. How about saying, oh, you know what? I'm not in favour of allowing men in a dress to propagandize my 4-year-old child. See what happens to you then. Or anything. You're free to agree, but that's the end of it. I'm not even complaining about this. I have a view which is formed of real politics. I understand. I'm not complaining about any of this. I'm just pointing out how it actually works. I've never, I don't know, intuitively, I've never believed in democracy. I've always thought it was a completely idiotic idea. The powerful do as they will, and the weak do as they must. That just seems to me quite obvious. And what propaganda is a sort of interface between those two realities. So rather, what they discovered, just very briefly, because I'm going to wind this up for the YouTube people right now, and there's about 2/3 to go for my paid Substack audience. But what happened in terms of, say, management, there's just a difference of style between the 1940s. Management was basic. Okay, Jones, we're going to tell you to do this. Off you go, chap. We want it by 5 o'clock. Chop, chop. That's how they talk to people in offices, in businesses. Not anymore. Now, if you work in a big company, it's they call you by your first name and ask you if you'd like to consider doing something. And they're really excited to see your results. It means exactly the same thing. It means get on with it. But rather than telling you directly, they use this kind of passive-aggressive sort of language to make you, to kind of couch it in a cotton wool of pseudo-choice. But there is no choice. You're going to have to do whatever it is. But it's so hypocritical now, because what I'm trying to say is democracy is like this. There's a plan. You didn't vote for it. Your opinion is irrelevant to it. Your job is to work on the conveyor belt, supporting the system that's building the prison that's going to and the killing fields that are there to destroy you. That's your job. And their job, the ruling elites, is to manage the morons in that process. And as part of that process, they give you this illusion called democracy, which if you actually think about it, just briefly about democracy, they can control your mind. Why would your opinion be important? And anyway, if you add it up, all the people, and sort of divide it by, 27.3 and come up with this one answer, they give you the people you vote for. They control your mind from beginning to end, from basically the cradle to the grave. The whole thing is a complete farce. And, the people that you're voting for are members of organizations to which they are highly compromised. And just look around you. I mean, if you don't accept what I'm saying, just look around you in Europe and North America today. How many, and obviously Australia and New Zealand, how many actual statesmen are there? Any man with some actual gumption. I don't mean who isn't just a soulless propagandist, popularist. You can count them on the fingers of one hand, and that's from all countries. Literally, they're all interchangeable. They're mediocrities, and because these types of people are the kinds of people who thrive in a totalitarian state. What you have is totalitarianism with bubblegum. It doesn't look like it. It doesn't look like totalitarianism, because you always think that totalitarianism looks like what you get in 1984, but it actually is. It's just, instead of telling you, Jones, go and do this, they're asking if you're excited to, they're excited to see the results of it. It's just couched in this language. Anyway, that was longer than I wanted to do that, but I get the feeling I'd like to kind of get these sort of things out of my system. That's the end for YouTube's, what the other ones, Odyssey and Rumble and all of that for this. I'm going to continue for my paid subscribers on Substack. I expect I've got about another 40 minutes to go. Details of where I upload to, how you can join my Substack and Telegram channel, support my work and download my books free, are in the description. Thanks for listening, YouTube and those other platforms. And that's bye for now.